Ranking kickers for the fantasy football playoffs has become one of the most highly recommended videos on my channel because everybody understands that kickers can make or break your entire week. So outside of going down there and dropping a like on this video and subscribing to the channel to show your support, understand that Justin Tucker is a disaster, and this is why you do not draft a kicker inside of the first 10 rounds of your fantasy drafts at the beginning of August. Going down to our first tier right here with that out of the way, Chris Boswell is at number 1. And I think that he's obviously great. There's no question that what Chris Boswell has done the majority of the year indicates that he has the highest ceiling and one of the safest floors. That's the reason he's at number 1 here. And I like his matchups versus Baltimore and Kansas City because we obviously know that Baltimore game, that's majority of the time a massive field goal game. So I expect him to have another 20-point game. Honestly, sounds crazy. I'm expecting a 20-point game out of him. Kansas City, I expect a very similar performance here because Kansas City does give up points. Their defense is not as good as it was at the beginning of the year. The only problem I have with Boswell in this playoff stretch is the Philadelphia matchup. I think they will struggle against the Philadelphia Eagles. In Philadelphia, I think that's just not a good matchup for Chris Boswell as a whole, but just based on the fact that those last two matchups are fantastic, yeah, Chris Boswell's a number 1 kicker this year in the fantasy playoffs. And then Fairbairn's at number 2. Fairbairn has been a little bit more, like he's been the most consistent kicker over the year. If you look at this guy's game log, it's been basically nothing but double-digit performances. That's because the Texans' offense is always good enough to get you down there in range, but they're never good enough to finish. And it just doesn't look like it's gotten any better with the return of Nico Collins here. So I just think that Fairbairn is so consistent no matter what his matchups are, he's going to be in there. And again, Kansas City, Baltimore, I like that matchup, and then Miami, I like the matchup as well. Matchups are great. But ultimately, Fairbairn is a little bit below Chris Boswell because he doesn't have the massive ceiling of 20 to 25 points that Chris Boswell does on a more regular basis. And then with number 3, Cameron Dicker here. I think that Cameron Dicker has been awesome. And the secret is, with Cameron Dicker, why he's over someone like a Jake Bates or Brandon Aubrey or Will Lutz, is because of the fact that Cameron Dicker, since J.K. Dobbins went down against the Baltimore Ravens on Monday night, has been awesome. The floor has gone from the floor is still great. The floor is basically like 8 to 10 points, but that ceiling is basically close to 20. So I think that with this matchup stretch here, Tampa Bay, Denver, and New England, they're all great matchups, and I do think that Cameron Dicker is just going to continue to do this because this offense, similar to the Texans, good enough to get you down there, not as often, but they're always going to stall out because they don't have the playmakers, and especially if Vlad McConkey goes down, they're going to be in real trouble. Dropping down to our next tier right here, we've got Jake Bates at number 4. We just went through Jake Bates briefly, and listen, he's been awesome as well. He's a little bit more streaky than Fairbairn and Cameron Dicker are, for example. But at the same time, like Jake Bates, I think his ceiling has become too high that it's irresponsible to keep him outside of the top 5. Like Jake Bates versus Buffalo, at Chicago, at San Francisco, when this guy has been one of the most consistent kickers over the last 2 months, basically. Like Jake Bates has only missed a couple kicks over that stretch, and his ceiling, his floor has kind of been around 12 points a little bit. So I just think that with Jake Bates, his ceiling is not tremendously high, but his floor is just becoming a lot more safer over the time because their offense is so freaking efficient. Will Lutz at number 5. Will Lutz, I think, is also fantastic as well. The good thing with Will Lutz right now is similar to the Chargers a little bit, but different. The Chargers, because of the fact that with the Chargers offense, you're always going to get down there because that's what they've been doing all year. Now, this is different because Will Lutz is on an offense that's actually been getting in the end zone more frequently. So Will Lutz, there will be certain games where he gives you 2 points, 4 points, and that's dicey when you're talking about the fantasy playoffs. But just looking at his last 2 games in particular, this is what he can give you. 22 points, 11 points. This guy rarely misses kicks. He's automatic, basically. And I think that with this matchup against Indy specifically in the first week, and then the Los Angeles Chargers the second week, those are great matchups, and I think that the Cincy matchup in Week 17 is ultimately a good one too. So the only concern I have with him is what if they get in the game against Cincinnati Cincinnati and ended up having 4 touchdowns, and they only gets 4 extra point attempts and gets 4 points. That's a problem here, and it definitely is in the cards, and that's why he's down here at 5. And then Brandon Aubrey at 6 to round out this tier. Brandon Aubrey, I've come back around on him. You guys know I made a famous announcement. He was outside of the top 12 kickers recent weeks. That's because the Cowboys have stunk. Like, he came out of the bye week and didn't hit 9 fantasy. He hit 9 fantasy points one time over the next month. But since week 12 versus the Commanders, he's had 12 points and 9 points. This offense has shown signs of life. And the good thing is, I do think he's got some beatable matchups here coming up. Carolina, that's a great matchup. Carolina, they should be able to move the ball against. Tampa Bay, they should be able to move the ball against them pretty decently. Again, the Philly matchup, that's probably one where you just want to cut ties at the end of the year in your championship and just go with a different kicker here, because that's a bad matchup. And it is important to note, this is the worst kicker in this tier. Although I love Brandon Aubrey, and he's a great NFL kicker, his offense sucks so bad, and he's so reliant on the fact that Cooper Rush is make or break every single week. So I just don't trust Brandon Aubrey throughout the duration of the fantasy playoffs. If you did not get in on any of the best ball tournaments this summer, first of all, that sucks for you. It really does. There's no way around it. But the good thing is I got into a bunch of these playoff best ball drafts last year, and you could seriously get some significant capital if you end up placing really well. There's plenty of tournaments on here that you draft players that you believe are heading into the NFL playoffs, and then you play best ball in that format. This is a really fun way to play best ball, and if you want to get in on it and not be done with fantasy football when the season actually ends, go down in the comments and grab the link that's there and use code FFN to sign up for Underdog. And when you get in on one of these tournaments for the NFL playoffs, they'll match your first deposit 50% up to $1,000 in bonus cash. So dropping down to our next tier right here, I've got Will Reichard. You remember that name, right? Vikings kicker on the IR past several weeks. Yeah, he's coming back here pretty soon. May not be in week 14, but it should be by week 15. And if you look at what John Parker Romo has done in this absence, hopefully they stick with, if they do stick with John Parker Romo, he's in this spot as well. But ultimately, it comes down to whoever the Vikings kicker will be is going to be a great kicker in the fantasy playoffs. This offense is running so well for a fantasy kicker. They basically kind of split time where they sometimes kick field goals and then they sometimes capitalize in the end zone. This offense is always getting you down there regardless, though. It's sort of like Washington's offense over the past, majority of the year. So with the Vikings kicker, whoever it may be, is going to be a great opportunity for them in the fantasy playoffs. Versus Chicago, at Seattle, versus Green Bay. 2 divisional matchups, and then you've got Seattle, who is definitely capable of giving up points to a kicker. So I just think that Will Reichard, whether it's him, whether it's John Parker Romo, you need to keep a major close eye on whoever the Vikings kicker will be, because he's going to be a great fantasy kicker in the playoffs. At number 8, Harrison Butker also will be returning in time for the fantasy football playoffs, probably. By all accounts, he should be able to return. So with Harrison Butker here, if you just look at what Matthew Wright did, his one game with Kansas City last week, he had like 13 or 14 fantasy points. And again, this offense has just gotten less efficient getting to the end zone, that they're still good enough to get you down there. That's what makes me want to use Harrison Butker. So Harrison Butker, the only thing that keeps him down here is he's been a little bit inaccurate this year. Maybe that's because he's been injured, and maybe he'll come back out of the injury and be accurate again. I don't know exactly, but I do know that matchup doesn't ever matter versus the Kansas City Chiefs, right? I don't see any defense coming in here and stopping them, even the Pittsburgh Steelers defense. So Harrison Butker, as long as he comes back with a clean bill of health and ends up kicking for them again, he should be a top 10 kicker in the fantasy playoffs. And then at number 9, rounding out this tier, Jason Sanders. Now, with Jason Sanders, I have discussed him over the past month. Since Tua has returned from injury, Jason Sanders has been a totally different kicker in fantasy, one that you can play on a consistent basis. Now, he was outside of the top 12 kickers for me in week 13, the Thanksgiving week where they went to Green Bay because I hated the weather, and he ends up kicking a 3-point game. Now, that's the problem that I want to go through here. The first 2 matchups, I like them. Versus Houston and versus San Francisco. Both of them warm weather places. One of them's in a dome. So I've got no problem with his first 2 matchups in particular. What I have a problem with is when he goes to Cleveland at the end of December. Cleveland's already had a bunch of bad weather this year, and if this team goes to bad weather, you can kiss a good fantasy day goodbye for the majority of their options outside of Devon Achane. So if you have Jason Sanders, you can use him the first 2 weeks of the playoffs here. But when you get to that final week right there against Cleveland, I'm telling you guys, you will want to move off of him and probably end up getting someone from the last tier that we're going through. Brandon McManus is a great option come the fantasy playoffs here. Brandon McManus has already been really good. For the Green Bay Packers, this guy comes right in a very, very bad weather game against the Miami Dolphins on Thanksgiving Day, and he kicks a really good game versus the Miami Dolphins. 13 fantasy points, was perfect, and he has not missed a kick all year for them. He's been perfect for the Green Bay Packers here. So ultimately, I just think that when I look at Brandon McManus, I think to myself, this guy is not missing any kicks. He's done really well for them. It's a high potency offense here. Match and weather is not a concern. So specifically, when we're looking back to Jason Sanders in week 17, look at his matchup at Minnesota. That's in a dome. It doesn't even matter, but that's a divisional game where there should be a lot of scoring and a lot of fireworks in that matchup where points are going to be out all over the place in fantasy football. So I think Brandon McManus that last week, probably a great replacement if he's on the waiver wire for Jason Sanders in week 17 particularly, but also a good guy to get just for the other two games as well. And then Chase McLaughlin at number 11. I just think that he's a little bit more inconsistent. Like, he is not exactly always going to get you a steady 10 points, a steady 8 points. Chase McLaughlin is a number 9 kicker this year, but he has had games where he's had 5 fantasy points, he's had 6 fantasy points, but really the majority of the time his floor is around 8 to 9 fantasy points, sometimes 7. Pretty safe floor with upside of 16, 15 fantasy points. This guy can hit you on really big weeks for a kicker. So those last 2 matchups in particular, at Dallas and versus Carolina, great matchup opportunities there. Now, again, the only thing keeping him down here low for me is the fact that he's been a little bit inconsistent with accuracy and just with upside, but I like his opportunities here just fine. And Nick Folk, coming out of nowhere. I mean, this guy, I've been watching him, kind of keeping an eye on him over the past 2 weeks, and then I went to go look for him on the waiver wire in 2 of my leagues, and between 2 leagues, 2 people between 2 leagues spent $28 collectively on Nick Folk. I was like, okay, he's not that valuable. Like, let's get that straight. Nick Folk has definitely done better, though. And this coincides with what I've been saying about Will Levis a bunch over the past week, is that Will Levis is not playing the worst football right now. And their stretch here has done really well for Nick Folk. The past 3 games, 8 points, 18 points, 9 points for Nick Folk. He's done really well. And again, the playoff stretch is a really good one. Cincinnati, at Indy, and at Jacksonville. Like, these are good matchups he's about to take on divisional opponents, and 2 of them have really bad defenses here. So if Nick Folk can continue to have success and luck with Will Levis playing not his worst football right now and end the year strong, I think Nick Folk is actually a decent option come the playoffs. So let me know what your position in the playoffs is, and if you want to see the top 12 defense that are updated for the fantasy playoffs, click on this video right here.